In this module, we're going to do an exercise where we create a transaction from scratch and we submit it for calculation. In the last lecture, we talked about the different transaction objects. We talked about the base transaction, the credit transaction, the earning transaction, and the payment transaction. So in this lab, we're going to log into the user interface and create a new transaction from scratch. We're then going to submit it for crediting, which is then going to yield a credited transaction, and then we're going to submit it for calculation against the compensation plan that we built earlier, and then that's going to yield us an earning transaction. And so as part of your training materials, you should have a lab exercise entitled Transaction Creation and Calculation. I ask you to take that lab out, and we're going to walk through this exercise together. So to get started, I'm going to navigate over to my browser, and I'm going to navigate over to the Global Apps login page. And like the previous labs, I'm going to log in as Ed Kelly and use my password. And I'm back in the application. So to do this exercise, we're going to go to the work area entitled Credits and Earnings. And when I'm brought to this screen, this is one of the work areas that are designed for the compensation managers, the people that are running the day-to-day process of collecting transactions, doing the calculations, the adjustments, etc. When I enter this work area, I see a number of embedded analytics that may help a comp manager be more productive. I can see reports for transactions by status. I can see those transactions that may have been held over a certain period of time. I can see the credits by status as well as the earnings by status. If I widen the time period a little bit, let's say I want to pull up transactions from July of 2014 till August of 2015. I click search. And I can quickly see that 54% of the transactions are classified as, or have a current status of new, and 45.96% of them have a status of credited. If I select a piece of the pie here, the selection in blue, it runs a saved search behind the scenes. And so now it's queried for me all transactions from July of 2014 till August of 2015 that have the status of credited, and then it's done a very quick search for me that allows me to go in and make whatever selections or adjustments that I need to. I'm going to hide the left navigation to give myself a little bit more real estate. So from here I can see I can tab through fields on the transactions. For the compensation managers, we do support inline editing as well as list of values to maintain data integrity. Now, while it's great that I can see these transactions, at the end of the day, this is only about 3 inches of real estate on my screen. If I wanted to move this to a full screen, I simply click the detach button. And I now have a full screen view that I can tab through to make whatever changes that are necessary for the business. Now, a lot of times when I'm working with customers, what I'll do is I'll describe this screen as a very Excel-like interface where I can tab through multiple columns like I could in a spreadsheet and either add or augment information. I often use the analogy that it's like a spreadsheet, like Excel, but rendered within your browser. And I often say that because many comp managers and comp analysts are very, very comfortable using Excel. However, truth be told, it's not Excel. And for those users that prefer using Excel, under Actions on the top right, we have something that says Edit in Excel. And this is what invokes the FDI, or Fusion Desktop Integrator capabilities that I talked about earlier. And again, those of you that knew EBS and were familiar with Web ADI, it's almost identical. So from here, what I can do is I could simply select Edit in Excel, and it would launch this query of these transactions into an Excel file where I could then make the adjustments in Excel and then synchronize those changes back to Fusion Incentive Compensation. Again, it's a powerful option for many people that are more comfortable using Excel. If you want to see a quick glimpse of that, I'm going to select Edit in Excel. And my system's confirming to me that I do want to open Excel, so I'm going to select OK. And as a security step, it's telling me that I'm about to connect to the following application, which is the demo environment I'm using for this exercise, and it asks me if I want to connect, so I say yes. And because it's my first time logging in for the day into the Excel plugin, it's asking me to re-authenticate myself. So I'm just going to type Ed Kelly again, and my password, say sign in. And I'm now signed in and able to use Fusion Desktop Integrator. So from Excel, I could simply just click the search button right here. And it allows me to run a query all from within Excel. So what we did a second ago is we were pulling up all transactions from July 1st of 2014 to the end of August in 2015. And I just click search. It shows me a preview here. I say that looks okay, so I'm going to select the OK button. And as a comp analyst, I could now perform all the changes or adjustments that I need to do all from within Excel. I can scroll to the right to see all the columns that may have come down. This is particularly good for people that need to make mass adjustments. If I need to query up, say, 500 transactions and do a quick copy paste and make a quick change in Excel and just propagate that to each of the rows, that's very easily done from within this user interface. All the data integrity and list of values are also active within Excel. So for example, if I double click on one of the direct participant fields, I can see that it brings up a search screen where maybe I want to put, say, Lisa Jones as one of my salespeople. I'm going to select her and say that's fine. And then I can simply copy Lisa's name for maybe a number of transactions. And so as I've done that, I've obviously pasted her name to multiple rows, and then on the left-hand side here under changed, you'll note that the system is flagging those records that have been changed. And so what happens is once I've made whatever adjustments or changes that I want to within FDI, I simply click the upload button. And when I click upload, the system is smart enough to know those transactions that have not changed, it knows to ignore them, but those transactions that have changed, we would create an adjustment record for them. So we could go in and query for those transactions and see that the changes that we've made here in this example, that we've now associated a direct participant to these transactions, we would see that reflected within the Fusion Incentive Compensation application as soon as I clicked upload and then it's synchronized with the IC system. Again, just giving a little bit of a tour as to how FDI works. Let me click out of this. I'm not going to save the changes. And so again, that was the function under Actions called Edit in Excel. Now, chances are the first time you start using incentive compensation, if you want to play around with Fusion Desktop Integrator, you're going to need to download the plugin. In order to do that, from the navigator icon, simply select that. And then under Tools, you're going to see something that says Download ADF Desktop Integrator. So you need to download that, walk through the steps to install that plugin onto your local laptop, and then from there, when you click on Edit in Excel, you'll be able to output the transactions into an Excel file on your laptop and do whatever changes or augmentations that you want. So again, that's not part of the exercise that we're doing right now, but I just wanted to give you guys a tour to understand how that worked. To get back to the exercise, we're going to create a new transaction from scratch. And in order to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up the left navigation. And in the left navigation, you're going to see the 3 of the 4 transaction objects. You're going to see the base transactions, the credited transactions, and the earning transactions. I mentioned a little bit ago in the last lecture that the next module is on payments. And there's actually another work area called the payments work area, and we'll go into that in detail in the next module. So on this screen, we're on the Manage Transactions screen where we have the search results for all the transactions that we got from the home page of the Credits and Earnings work area. From this screen, if I wanted to create a new manual transaction, I could simply click the Create icon right here, or I can click the Create Transaction hyperlink on the left-hand side. Now, one of the things to note, and we talked about this earlier, is that there are a number of ways to get new transactions into the system. We can import them through CSV files or XML files. We could have the source system call the transaction web service so that it could be brought over real time. We could do uploads in bulk via Web Center, where the customer can use their ETL tool of choice, extract those transactions from the source system, do whatever level of transformation and data quality they want to in the transformation layer, and then load it into Web Center in the cloud, where it can then be picked up by the incentive compensation staging tables. If you work with development or product management, they actually have exercises and best practices on all those approaches. But for this exercise in this lab, we're going to create a one-off manual transaction from within the user interface. And in order to do that, I'm going to select the Create Transaction hyperlink. And I'm going to minimize the left navigation bar. And from here, I can just enter the base information for a transaction. So according to the lab, we're going to use our initials and name this transaction. I'm going to use JL123. And in the lab, you'll see that for the transaction date, we tell you to put in your birthday for the current calendar year. So in reality, the reason that we do that is when we teach this class live, and we have 20 or 30 or 40 partners in the room all concurrently creating transactions, we want to have some level of filter so not everyone is stepping on one another. Because in reality, we're already stretching the imagination because we would have a number of concurrent users all logged in as Ed Kelly, all creating transactions simultaneously, which of course wouldn't happen in the real world with everyone logged in with the same user ID. But in a classroom environment, we do take some liberties. So in order to help streamline the process, what we do is we ask each participant to try to enter a unique date. You're welcome to do that or use any date within the defined start and end period of the compensation plan that you built earlier. So we can skip the discount percentage and margin percentage and the quantity. You can certainly enter information to this. Maybe I want to have a quantity of 5. But in reality, the compensation plan that we built, the calculation isn't referencing quantity anyway. For transaction amount, let's say that the transaction amount that was done for transaction number JL123, let's say that the amount was $600,000. We're saying that the person we hired is a US employee, so we'll keep the currency at US dollars. And let's associate the person that we hired to the transaction. I could also associate additional information if I wanted to put on the participant's role, if I had from the source system, the order number, the book date, the invoice number, etc. There's a lot of additional information I could add. I say this looks good as a base level, so I'm going to simply select Save and Close. And then to see the transaction's been created, I'm going to query for the initials of JL and click Search. And I can see JL123 has been created. Actually, now that I think of it, I did omit an important thing. So let me drill back into my transaction. So I had the transaction amount and the currency, and I put my name on it, but I didn't denote what product sold. Under Global Attributes, let me scroll down a little bit. Under Global Attributes, there's a lot of additional information that can be captured on the transaction. We talked about this a little bit earlier, and we'll actually talk in further detail about it in later modules. But Fusion Incentive Compensation has the ability to extend out the data model to capture whatever fields you need to from the source system. And if you remember from the very first exercise that we did, the compensation plan that we built, it was the green servers compensation plan. So on this transaction, I wanted to note that this product that's being sold for $600,000 aligned with the product that was sold as green servers. And so in order to do that, under this field called Product Group, I'm simply going to select green servers. Now I say it looks good, and so I click Save and Close. Now this is actually an opportunity to see something that you would not have seen if green servers had been added to the transaction from the get-go. If I requery for JL, I'll now see that there are 2 transactions listed for JL. I'll see that there's a record on the bottom that's frozen and cannot be updated. And then I'll see that there's a record on the top that does have the inline editing and I can continue to make changes. So what I did was I went in and I created the initial transaction. I put quantity of 5 and I put 600,000 and the direct participant was Jason Lowe, and I clicked save and close. And then I went back into the transaction, then added green servers. So when I added that addition, what I did was I made an adjustment. And so what the application does is it froze the original transaction so that there's always a history, and then I can now see the newer transaction, which is still editable. Now, if I'd wanted to, if I'd thought about it ahead of time and thought this was a teachable moment, I would also have noted that I could have gone in and added specific user comments as to what adjustment I was making, as well as selected a reason code. But I can see here that the bottom transaction has a status of obsoleted, and the more current one has the status of new. Now, if you're someone that used the eBusiness Suite incentive compensation application, this is nothing new to you. Every time you would make an adjustment, it would create an obsolete or a frozen record, and then it would propagate a new record as well. The challenge with that is that once you'd made 5 or 10 or 15 adjustments, the number of rows for a single transaction in EBS could get very, very long. With Fusion, we maintain all of that history, but we don't clutter up the UI by creating multiple rows. And in order to collapse these rows and to move the obsoleted transactions to the History tab down here, we're going to run a process that's called Revert. So I'm going to expand the left navigation. I'm going to run the Revert transactions. And let's just revert them for the day that we're using, which is 7/13 of the year 2015. I click Submit. I can see that the process is created. If I want to view the status of any process on the left-hand side here, I simply select View Processes. And then I just click Refresh, and I can see that the Revert job is running. And now it's done. So if I navigate back to the Manage Transaction screen, and I query for JL, I'll now just see one transaction again, something that is editable via inline editing. And then if I look to the History tab down here, I'll see that original transaction has been moved to the history. Again, it just is a process to clean up the UI. We still maintain all the history and a complete record of all the adjustments. But within Fusion, unlike in EBS, where it would just generate long lists of transactions with frozen, reversed, obsoleted, in Fusion, they're all moved to the History tab. And so that's it. So I've created a transaction. Now, if I look at the sub-tabs under the transaction, there are the direct credits, roll-up credits, earnings, etc. I'll see that all of these fields are blank right now, because all that I've done so far is I've created the base transaction. Now, because I created the transaction as a one-off directly within the user interface, it bypassed the staging table and went straight to the base transaction table. If, on the other hand, I were importing transactions in, the first process I would have to do is I would have to run collect transactions. And what collect transactions would do is it would take it from the staging table, it would run all the error handling, deduping, data validation, etc., and then move it from the staging to then create base transactions. But because I created a one-off manual transaction within the application, I'm going to bypass that right now. So now I have my base transaction. And to take that and make that into a credited transaction, I need to run something called crediting and rollup. In order to do that, under Processes, I select the hyperlink that says Run Crediting and Rollup. And I'm going to run crediting and rollup just for the day. So again, if there are multiple people doing this lab at the same time, I encourage you just to run the processes on the date that you used for your transaction. So I'm going to do, let's do it for July 13th of 2015 as my start and end date to run crediting and rollup just on that date. And I click Submit. And again, to view the process of the job, I just click on View Processes, click Refresh, and it's done. If we go back to Manage Transactions, and again, query for that transaction of JL or whatever your initials are, I click search. I can now see that there is information on the direct credits, where now there is a credited transaction associated to this base transaction, and it's credited Jason Lowe, and he received 100% of the transaction. So now that we've identified who is receiving credit, we also need to identify the what. Remember, in the compensation plan design, we talked about the what, the how, and the how much. And the what is what's that eligible event or activity that's going to trigger something to happen. And that's something that we call, within the performance measure, something that we call the credit category. And so right here, I can see, yes, it's great that the credit receiver has been stamped on the transaction, but there is no credit category. And it's the credit category that's going to determine the eligibility to see, is our credit receiver tied to a compensation plan that's eligible to receive credit for selling this product? So in order to identify the what, or what's that eligible event or activity that's being triggered on this transaction, we're going to run a process called classify credits. So on the left-hand side, click the hyperlink that says classify credits. Again, I'll just do it for the specific date for my transaction. And I click submit. And again, to view the job, I go back over to view processes, click refresh, refresh again, and it's done. If I go back over to manage transactions, query on JL, I can now see that my credited transaction not only has the credit receiver on it, but I can also see that it's now stamped the credit category of green servers. So again, when we went back into the transaction, when we were creating it a couple minutes ago, and we added product group equals green servers, that's the what. That's that eligible event or activity. So when this credit receiver sells something that belongs to this family of credit categories, that's an eligible event that's ultimately going to trigger their compensation plan. And in order to trigger their compensation plan, let's calculate. And so what we're going to do is we now have the credited transaction, and we're going to submit that credited transaction for calculation, and that's now going to generate an earning transaction. In order to do that, we're going to go to our left-hand navigation again and select the hyperlink that says Manage Calculation Processes. And we're going to create a new calculation job simply by selecting the Create icon. Now I can name this calculation job, so let's name it JL_calc. Again, I could calc it for the entire year. I could calc it for maybe just a month or just a quarter, or I could calculate it for, say, a day. So let's just do it for the 1 day. For 7/13. I say that looks good. Now I could also calculate it for everyone. What that means is if I submit this for all participants, that means that it will calculate for everyone in the organization for this date on the calendar. But because this is a lab exercise and potentially there are multiple people doing this exercise even with the same birthday, what I'm going to do is I'm going to select a specific participant. And let's just calculate for the person that we created in an earlier module, and I created myself. So let me click search, select myself, say apply, say done. It says apply because I could multi-select people. Maybe I want to do Lisa Jones and Julian Henderson and Cindy Cochran and a number of other demo characters. But for this exercise, I'm just going to submit with one credit receiver on the job. So I'm going to click the submit button. And then again, to check the status of the job, I go to View Processes, and I click Refresh, and refresh again, and one more time, and it's done. So now if I go back to Manage Transactions, and I query for JL, click Search, I can see that my transaction, I had the direct credits, which had my credit receiver, and it had the credit category on it. But if I go over to the Earnings tab, I can now see that I have a calculated result. I can see that the credit receiver, I can see it triggered this compensation plan, which was JL Green Servers, as well as the plan component. It has a status of calculated. I can see that the original transaction amount was $600,000, of which I was credited 100% of that, which is again $600,000. And then based on the rules in my compensation plan, it's yielding me an earning amount of $33,000. And that's it. I've created a base transaction from scratch. In this example, we did it from within the user interface. I submitted it against the crediting rules so that it created a credited transaction. And then I submitted it for calculation to then create what's called an earning transaction. And it's yielding me an earning amount of $33,000. Now let's say hypothetically you were calculating, but maybe the result you received is not the result you were expecting. If you remember in the last module, in the last lecture, I talked about the concept of show your work. And I talked about back when you were in junior high or high school, you would have had a class, algebra, geometry, etc., where you had to show your work. And even if you got the wrong answer, you may still have gotten partial credit. And so if I click on the calculation details, if I need to troubleshoot a transaction, I'm going to minimize the left side to give myself a little bit more real estate. So for any transaction, for any calculation that goes through, it takes a snapshot of what were the variables, what was the input achieved, what was the output achieved, was there a goal or a quota associated to it, which in our compensation plan we had one, what was the earning rate, are we processing the transactions individually, are we grouping them, as well as what are the calculations, or what are the mathematical expressions that we're using. So in this example, we're taking the rate table result times the credit amount. So we capture this for the formula information, for the result information, for the rate information, for credits, for measure details, etc. So as a system implementer implementing a compensation plan for a customer, or as a customer rolling out a new compensation plan, inevitably things don't work perfectly the first time. And you may find yourself scratching your heads as to how did this calculation come to be. So one of the powers of Oracle's incentive compensation solution is this concept of show your work, where we're able to capture the variables so that people can very quickly troubleshoot or better understand what happened within a calculation. And I think I mentioned this earlier, is that what's also beneficial is if I'm a comp admin or a participant resource who's managing disputes and a sales rep logs a dispute inquiry as to why was I paid this much, the comp admin can quickly go into the application, query for the transaction that they're talking about, and reverse engineer, oh, this is how the math was calculated. So again, this is calculation details, or what I call show your work. And with that said, that concludes this lab. Again, where we went into the application as Ed Kelly, we created a base transaction manually from within the Create Transaction hyperlink within the Credits and Earnings work area. We then submitted that base transaction through crediting in order to generate a credit transaction, and then we submitted that credit transaction to the calculation process in order to generate an earning transaction. And what that leaves us with is we've just calculated our first transaction. And so in the next module, we're going to talk about the payment transaction and the payments work area.